Okay, so for everybody who participated in our live interview with Jemar Tisby, this is now a recorded interview because there was so much more that we wanted to get to that we just didn't have time for. We wanted to respect the time of the event that we had. So, Jemar, I'm just going to jump right in. This is the question that we left off from. Sarah asks, I learned my aunt voted for Trump 2 times. In October, I reached out, tried to dialogue with her, and understand her motivations. She declined. How should I deal with her now?
Whew. The first thing I think about is the passage in the Gospels, where Jesus sends out the disciples 2 by 2 and says, "Go preach the gospel. If they welcome you, great. If not, kick the dust from your sandals and move on." So this is hard because this is your aunt. This is family, right? And I'm not saying do this in like slam the door kind of way. I'm done with you. What I'm saying is there is almost it's almost a way of dignifying people to let them be where they are. It's almost because you don't want to drag somebody kicking and screaming to a place where they don't want to be, particularly in terms of racial justice. Your aunt is not there yet, and what's going on is much more than an intellectual dialogue. This is about an ideology. It's about identity. And when you ask her, well, help me understand, she's already sort of reflexively defensive, psychologizing a little bit here, but it's almost like an attack on her identity. I think what you can do in those situations, what we must do, is make our stances clear. It may not persuade the other person, but at least they know where you stand. At least they know what you represent. And you'll be surprised. It may not be your aunt, but you'll be surprised at the number of people who eventually come around and at least express some curiosity. I could tell you some stories. I've received letters and DMs. I'm interacting with people in my own congregation, people I never thought would want to read a book like How to Fight Racism or engage actively in racial justice. Over time and events that I couldn't control, gain some openness. So I would say, the best thing you can do, let her know where you stand and say you're here when she's ready.
Yeah. I found that a lot of people dehumanize very quickly. It's like, how could you, what idiot would believe these kinds of things? And I think that's a really powerful impulse that many of us are going to have to be very careful with, because the dehumanization and the othering is the very thing that only instantiates people more in their beliefs. This goes back to the Imago Dei idea. This goes back to relationships. You have to maintain a humanization in some ways, keeping in mind, of course, your own personal spiritual health and boundaries, right?
Right.
No one, especially Black people, are not obligated to do
That's
that.
right.
But so I want to make sure I say that. But for those who feel that they can, that's an important strategy to deploy.
Well, just real quick, I talk in the book about John Gottman and his study on marriage and relationships, and how the primary indicator that partners are going to separate is contempt.
Contempt. Yep. Yeah.
So yes, we have to constantly be on our guard against contempt for people who we consider are wrong, and they may indeed have made bad choices, but to sort of dehumanize them, or like you're saying, these questions that how could you, how dare you, aren't you, how stupid is it? Those kinds of things, I think, indicate that some contempt is crept in.
Yeah, I've been using the the axiom that the opposite of fear is not courage but curiosity, and sometimes when somebody is so offensive to you, your defenses get up. But if you can be curious as to where are they coming from, why are they thinking that, what are influencing, that can help to diffuse some of that contemptuousness that we all have. Such a good word. Michelle asks, how do we, living in the diversity of the Silicon Valley, help to impact those areas of our country that are living in a much different reality? So I'm presuming people who are outside of Silicon Valley.
Yeah. I think, So my visits to California, by the way, my dad grew up for his first 10 years in Southern California. So I do have a sort of connection there. I'm kind of jealous of y'all in there.
Hey, come on out. You're welcome anytime.
Listen, I am there as soon as this pandemic lifts. We will come for a visit. But one of the things that I've noticed in California, Silicon Valley area, you do have a lot of diversity, but there still ain't a lot of black folk that I encountered. I could be wrong. I don't know the numbers.
Yeah.
One thing I want to be careful of is that we do focus and learn and push back against anti-black racism. Because in a white supremacist society, it creates two categories, whiteness and blackness. Whiteness is seen as normal, standard, right? Well, blackness is seen as its opposite of substandard, abnormal, exotic, wrong. And of course, there's everything in between there, right? You can talk, Kevin, about the Asian American experience and all of the racism wrapped up in that. And you're caught up in white supremacy, too, in the way that it structures people groups, right? But never forget that the thing has been anti-black racism, which is not oppression Olympics, right?
Right.
It's not let's compare the suffering of different people groups and see who wins. It's not about that. It's to say that in a white supremacist society, what really irks racists to no end is blackness. Mm-hmm. I say all that in Silicon Valley, Palo Alto area, wherever you might be. Are you still addressing the issue of anti-blackness? Or has it been subsumed in this sort of broad diversity, multi-ethnic, whatever, right? Because then we lose some of the specificity, which means we lose some of the potency, right? So I would say even in a place that's a lot more diverse than other communities, to still pay attention to anti-blackness. And then the question was, how do you impact other areas that don't have as much diversity? Well, I think you prepare your own people for that, right? So what if somebody is in your community now but moves away? How are they set up to continually advocate for racial justice wherever they are? So that means constantly bringing this up. I don't think these issues are as external as we might imagine, right? So there are other people of color who might hold anti-black ideas. All of this stuff is a lot closer to home than we realize.
Yeah. With a new administration, do you think it will be easier to turn off the light switch for white people? If so, how do we combat that?
Yes and no. So with the previous president, the alarm was on constantly. You never knew when a tweet would change the national conversation around race or immigration or whatever it might be, right? And so there's a sense in which with a more competent administration that's not going to legislate by tweet or social media, the issues don't seem as urgent. And so in that sense, yeah, it might be easier to turn off the light switch. There's also the sense in which, we had months and months and months in 2020 of sustained protests. Now, those have sort of died down, although, the activism and the advocacy have not gone away. But the more sort of public headline grabbing stuff isn't there. So in that sense, it could you could turn the light switch off. But I think two things. One, in his inauguration speech, Joe Biden used the words white supremacy, which may be the first time any president has used those words in an inauguration speech. So I think there is pressure from more progressive Democrats and liberals to make sure that this administration makes some substantive changes. So in that sense, there are activists who are laboring mightily to keep the light switch on. But the other thing I'll say is we shouldn't trust ourselves to keep the light switch on. We should set up structures that make it easier to keep it on.
That's good.
And so that's some very basic stuff. It's like, who do you follow on social media? Because, there are going to be people who constantly bring it up like me.
Right.
what faith communities are you a part of? Is racial justice a priority there? Because it's going to constantly come up.
Right.
And if it's not, then it's going to be easier to shut off that light switch. Sort of, how do you spend your time? If we almost think about our schedule as a budget, right? Are you involved in groups? Could be civic groups, could be church groups, or faith groups, could be book study groups that constantly are talking about issues of justice that make it harder for you to turn it off.
Yeah.
So how can you sort of set up your own life to where you're always going to run into it, even if you yourself are more prone to turn that switch off?
Yeah. I'm kind of thinking a little bit of a sports analogy. Sometimes when you're losing, you have to fight. But once you start winning, you actually have to really keep fighting because you've got momentum. That's the point where you just got to keep pushing, because that momentum is something that's really going to make a significant advance. So I don't know if that works, but that's kind of what came to mind. Next question, thoughts on what individuals can do in the area of reparations. For example, I heard an idea floating where individuals can pay off student loans for Black students.
Yeah. That's what Georgetown University is doing. They saved their university in the 1800s by selling some of the enslaved people that the university owned, and they tracked down the descendants of those enslaved people and are offering them, tuition relief to come. Yeah, so that's one way. Another thing is Duke Kwan and Greg Thompson have a new book coming out called Reparations, and they talk about ecclesiastical. Yeah, so they're doing it from a Christian perspective, and they're talking about ecclesiastical reparations, and basically saying you don't have to wait on the federal or state government to take action. As people of faith, you know right from wrong, and you can do something. You can take initiative, and so that could be one of the things I mentioned in the book. Is like so many Black pastors and people of color are bivocational. If they're pastors, right? Like they've got a day job that pays the bills, and they cannot, for financial reasons, devote themselves full time to their faith community. So what would it look like to pay the salary so that could be, full time? What would it look like owing to the wealth gap and owing to redlining and whatnot to help Black churches pay off their mortgages for a church building? So there's lots of different ways. One thing I would caution against is if you're still in a white supremacist organization like a school, offering scholarships to go to that organization, like I just think you're setting folks up for more trauma. And so what would it look like to have sort of unrestricted scholarships and grants, which may be easier for faith communities to offer than colleges and universities, where folks can go to the school of their choosing and not simply to a place that like 15 minutes ago realized it was racist and wants to do something about it, namely for the brochure. But they're still, inviting Black people and people of color into an environment that's really not healthy.
Yeah. This seems to me tied to the other awareness. Was it? Yeah, I think it was awareness where you encouraged us to actually read our church documents and read our own church history, whether it's an independent church or a denominational church. And if you do that work and go all the way back, you'll be able to find moments where there's marginalization. Well, both marginalization, clear racist ideologies or movements, but then also some founding documents that can help you understand how best to apply this racial justice within your own church context using that church history. So anyway, that's tied to that in my mind. Makes sense. Jemar, so many white churches and ministries still have not condemned the white supremacy in the Capitol insurrection. How should we respond?
It's really discouraging. Like I said in the live recording, we've seen so much that at this point, if churches and church leaders are digging in their heels, that is very telling to me. I mean, we have to try in as many ways to impress upon the people who have platforms, the people who have decision-making powers, like this is the time to make public declarations about where you stand on racial justice, where you stand on just truth. I mean, certainly people of faith and Christians specifically should be known as people who pursue truth wherever it might be found and wherever it might lead. And so we have an epistemological crisis on our hands where people are living in different epistemological ecosystems that are almost impervious to other perspectives. And so that's what we're dealing with. And the problem goes so deep. It's not like one conversation or even one person can fix it. What we can do, as I said before, is make our stances known. What we can do, I think, especially in faith communities, is continually press the idea of truth. And so I even went so far in my church context as to show data about the ideological leanings of different news outlets, from progressive to conservative. And I try to impress upon people that the issue is not that these outlets have a bias or a leaning. It's identifying it, and it's sifting through that data to make sure that the information you're getting is accurate. And so I was as explicit as saying, don't listen to Breitbart, OAN, even much of Fox News, certainly the televised portions. I said, if you want to listen to some conservatives who are, reasonable and really trying to pursue conservatism as they see it, I mentioned folks like David French, who I don't agree with all of his stances or anything, but it's a reasonable voice, right? Like, if you want to read news outlets, Wall Street Journal is pretty reputable. Its op-eds are hit and miss, but as far as reporting information. And then I say, CNN is actually on the spectrum, not that progressive. It's just, certain politicians and leaders made it out to be as fake news and whatever. But even still, if you don't want to do CNN, do the Associated Press, do Reuters, do the BBC, do NBC, USA Today. Those are sort of middle of the spectrum, just reporting the news, not a whole lot of interpretation with it. So I would be that explicit, and until we can sort of pierce that bubble of the media messages that they're getting, it's going to be really hard to have conversations.
Wow, that's a can of worms. Yeah, no, that's a whole other issue. Two more questions. I don't know I'll just read them both and we can decide if you want to cover them both or just one. The EU blocked all exports of COVID vaccine to majority world nations. USA, Canada are also stockpiling. How should we respond to the global injustice like this? Question number 2, regarding the Imago Dei and theology, Wesleyan quadrilateral role of experience in guiding efforts for reconciliation. How do our theological frameworks guide our action?
I'll start with the second one. How do our theological frameworks guide our action? Oftentimes it's our actions that shape our theological frameworks, or at least our actions that reveal it. That's why I love history. Yeah. History has the receipts. We can say a whole lot of pretty sounding things theologically, but our actions tell what we truly believe. And so what I would do is, certainly we want to sort of access good theology around justice, right? So I access, the Black church tradition has rich resources for this. Folks like Howard Thurman and his book Jesus and the Disinherited should be required reading. Things like The Letter from a Birmingham Jail, biographies of people like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, all of that. So we have to sort of look for theology in non-traditional places, if you will. It's not always in the academy. It's not always in a textbook. It can be through music, through poetry, through sermons and speeches, right? So certainly you want to intentionally cultivate an intellectual framework that will help with justice. But at the same time, you sort of want to act your way into a justice framework. For me, so much of this came from being a teacher in one of the poorest counties in the country, and being face to face with kids and their families who were suffering from generational poverty, which was traced back to sharecropping, which traced back to race-based chattel slavery, because I live in the Delta. And it was encountering that human element. It was that experiential element. It was being on the front lines, in a sense, that helped me develop more of a theological framework, that helped me say, well, you know what, this image of God thing is really important as we're looking at people, across racial lines and class lines and gender lines and all of that stuff. So there's a sense in which we act our way into a theology. And so if we practice good acts and good actions, I think that helps us develop a healthy theology.
Yeah.
It's called ethics.
Yeah. Yeah. Sociologists have a term called praxis, which is you don't
Yes.
believe before you behave before you believe, right? So that's...
I could have saved 5 minutes of an answer. Yes, you got it. You got it.
No, it's just, I love it when you can triangulate truth. There's from the experience, from sociology, from studies, and it's like, oh yeah, there's a common thread here. So,
Right.
Any response to the global injustice? I mean, the rollout of the vaccine, it just makes sense that if there are injustices within the systems, then when it comes to COVID vaccine, the injustices don't go away. They're there to platform however the rollout of the vaccine is going to be. And so we're going to see those injustices in the vaccine rollout. So, I mean, this Mark asks, how should we respond? I don't know. Do you have any additional thoughts or reflections on that?
I mean, it's a hugely important problem, and when you have something, a crisis like a pandemic, it sort of highlights the cracks in the system.
Right.
I think what we've seen in the U.S. context is that character really does count, right? Like so on the global stage, you have to have sort of a critical mass of nations that recognize that we can act in ways that are going to benefit people globally, but it's going to pinch us a little bit because it's a lot easier to hoard resources for our own people in our own nation. Yeah. But if we can each sort of make these sacrifices, it's going to mean that no single nation bears the brunt of what needs to happen for more equitable distribution of these resources. How does that happen? Goodness gracious. I mean, it has to be proactive and not reactive on some sense, right? So what are the operating procedures internationally that we can set up when we're not in a crisis that are going to help us act more justly when we do reach a crisis, which is always going to be inevitably. The other part is what we've seen in the U.S. is that character really counts in our leaders, right? So the decision makers that we put in place really matter when it comes to making decisions like this that are to some degree more generous, more selfless than one would expect. And so one of the things we can do is try to ensure that we have like people with big hearts in place, because some of it is like, even when we have to change laws, there are people in place who have to sort of advocate for that, push for that, vote for that. And the sort of character and moral and ethics of the people who we are putting in power do really come into play all the time, but we see it in stark relief in times of crisis when we have to band together and even sacrifice, in a sense, in a short term, some self-interest for the greater good.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Jemar, and thank you everyone for sticking around for part 2. We hope that we covered most of those questions for you. Again, we appreciate all you tuning in, and of course, please share all of this stuff wherever you have social media. Okay, have a good night, everybody. Bye.